Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of week 5 looking at quantitative research. Hopefully you've already listened to week 1, so ready to move on to week 2. Just continuing, or I guess part 2, just continuing looking at quantitative research. So after taking a look at some of the key considerations for doing when you're doing quantitative research and surveys and questionnaires and things like that, just wanted to go over some key steps to doing surveying. And, very simple, but very important. Things like the initial design and planning, designing the actual questionnaire, pre-testing the questionnaire, final design and planning, data collection, and then the data analysis and write-up. And very important that you leave time for each one of these steps because they all have their purposes along the way. So, initial design and planning. Now this is actually before you even start working on the questionnaire. This is thinking about, why are you doing the research? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the problem, the opportunity, whatever that you're trying to solve? Wanting to be very clear what you're trying to do, whether you're being descriptive or interpretive or actually testing an hypothesis. Where possible, and we've talked about this in class or as part of the course, the theoretical framework that you possibly are using, it's good to identify it right at the start. And, granted, these theoretical frameworks will change, or often will change throughout your research, but at least it gives you a starting point and some key things to be watching when you're doing your research. Very clearly, you need to identify who the population for your research is. So essentially, who are the people that you're talking about and trying to do the research on. Now, there's a difference, between population and your sample. Because your population is kind of everybody in the group that you're doing your research on, but the sample are those key specific people, the representatives of that population that you're actually going to question. So very clear, very important to clarify who's who, and part of that whole sample and sampling frame is figuring out how you're going to get that representative sample out of that population. And with that, ensuring that whatever sampling frame, whatever method you're using to get your sample, it needs to make sure that you do get a representative group. And if you're not going to get the right people in your sample, then you need to change how you're doing your sampling. With, as an example of that, online research, now this has changed somewhat lately, but typically online research tends to target more of a younger population, more tech savvy, generally, higher income, things like that. So if that's your population, then great. However, if you're using a method like that, a method like online research to try to attract what, general everyday population, then you really have to be careful because you're probably not going to get a completely representative sample. Is that a concern? Depends on your research. But it's definitely something that you need to be considering. Designing the questionnaire. Now, as I say there, it may be obvious, but you really have to make sure that the questionnaire is going to actually answer your research questions so that you can achieve your research objectives. So you should be able to take every single question that you have in your questionnaire and link it to one of your research questions. If you can't, then possibly it's something that you really don't need to be asking, and maybe it doesn't need to be in the questionnaire. So, carefully, once you've designed your questionnaire, make sure that you can link everything back up. Very briefly or very succinctly, good questionnaire needs to accurately answer the research questions, gain the cooperation of the respondents, and provide you with a valid result, both internally and externally, which we've already talked about. When you're designing that questionnaire, it's really, it's part science and part art. You're not going to be able to, follow some formula that will tell you exactly how to design the questionnaire. And that's fine. At times you need to be creative in order to get at the answers that you need. So, this can kind of speak to both those with a very scientific mind and those with a bit more creative. While it may be obvious, again, it's probably worthwhile stating that you need to remind the respondents to respond, to give you answers based on their own opinions, their own experiences, their own views. Unfortunately, it's very easy for a respondent to go, well, I don't read 5 magazines a week, but my family does. Well, unless the question is asking about family reading, then you need to remind them, well, okay, but how many do you read? Or how many, books do you read? How many times do you go to the store? Whatever the case may be. How do you choose a hotel? But again, it depends on who you're trying to get answers from, whether it's the respondent or the respondent is kind of representative of the family. While it may be really obvious again, if the respondent doesn't answer or doesn't understand the question, they're not going to be able to answer it correctly. So that's where pre-testing is so important. And that's where with some of the pre-testing, you will actually get people to talk through what they're thinking about as they're responding to the questions, so that you know that they're understanding things the way that you meant those questions to be asked. Another thing to think about is sometimes for your research questions, you may have to ask 2, 3, or more questions broken down into parts that are actually combined together to respond to your research questions. Sometimes you may do that also so that things aren't as, as obvious or as politically correct, and that you get a more true answer of a situation. So you break them down into small bite-sized pieces that are combined later by you. Closed questions, which is what you would typically find in most questionnaires, can be more limiting because essentially you're giving the respondent all of the possible answers, but it's also much easier to work with and much easier to analyze than an open-ended question. Again, some pre-testing and some qualitative research prior to developing the questionnaire can give you the answers that you need for a proper response set. Make sure when you have that set of fixed responses that there's a clear link between those answers and the central point of the question, that they cover most, if not all, of the main responses and possible options. They need to be mutually exclusive. So that means that one answer doesn't overlap or isn't partially covered by another question. Now, this may be a bad example, but for example, saying things like, do you watch TV from 0 to 2, 2 to 8, 4 to 10, more than 10 hours? You need to make sure that there isn't any overlap. And believe it or not, there are times where you will see a questionnaire where some of those different categories are overlapping. So that's where you need to be very careful. Another area where you will see with some questionnaires that aren't designed very well or aren't designed properly is a lack of balance or being on more than one dimension. And lack of balance, I provide you an example there, both of them being 4-point examples, but with one you go from very good, good, poor, very poor. So essentially 2 negatives and 2 positives versus excellent, very good, good, and poor, where you've really got 3 positives and 1 negative response. What happens with a situation like that is that you're essentially biasing the respondents towards a positive response. They've got 3 chances of giving you a positive response and only 1 chance of a negative response. So it pushes people towards a more positive response on a question like that. Now you can use different scales, different techniques, things like that Likert type scale, which is things like, very good, good, poor, strongly agree to strongly disagree. There's also things like what's called a semantic differential, which are kind of like a polar opposites question. Is this black or is it white? And they can answer kind of degrees. Well, it's kind of black or it's kind of white. Different scales within that. And all sorts of other things. Dichotomous scales where it's a yes, no, true, false. You've got only 2 options. So just be aware of that there's more than one way to ask a question. When it comes to wording your questions, some of the key things that are talked about in your text, things like keeping the language simple and, where possible, avoiding jargon, unless you're dealing specifically with a population that should and does deal with that jargon, so that you're trying to talk to them in their own language, with their own terms. Avoid jargon. There would be no point in me asking people about, what do you think about the CTC and the work that the CTC does if people don't know what the CTC is versus Canadian tourism or, Tourism Canada, whatever the case may be. Keep the questions short, succinct, a very short sentence so it's easy to understand. Avoid leading questions. Don't bring them down a path so that you essentially give them only one option to respond. Avoid double-barrel questions. So having 2 questions in the same, all in the same statement. Did you go shopping and buy anything at the store? Well, I went shopping, but I didn't buy anything, so how do I respond to that? Do I say, yes, I went shopping, or no, I didn't buy anything? Again, it may seem obvious, but it's one of those things that can be overlooked. And if you're asking about a sensitive topic, be very careful about how you ask the question, and where possible, try not to be too direct. When it comes to an interview-based question versus, mail-in or online, things like that, where somebody's actually asking the questions, it's important that you very clearly identify which parts are just for the reader of the questions versus which part of this questionnaire is actually supposed to be read out. And one trick that you'll very often see when you're in the industry or when you're doing these sort of questionnaires is anything just for the reader of the questionnaire will be put into all capital letters. It might say, if they don't answer this, skip to the next question, or probe here, whatever the case may be. But things that they're not supposed to be reading out, and it's just little prompts for the reader, for the person asking the questions. Any skips, and skips you can do, fairly easily with an online questionnaire. But and skips being, depending upon how they answer one question, you may skip a couple of questions because it's no longer relevant. Coming back to an earlier example, if I've asked you, did you go shopping? And you've already said no, there's no point me asking you where you went shopping. So I might as well skip to the next part of the question. And online, you can have it set up to automatically do that. But if you're reading it, if there's somebody actually doing the interview, especially if it's done on paper, you have to very clearly show where those skips occur. And good idea to have any open-ended question codes very clearly identified as the person is going through the questionnaire. Pre-testing. Always pre-test your questionnaire. And pre-testing can actually have several aspects to it, several phases to it, especially if in earlier pre-tests you're finding issues. If you don't have any issues, then there's probably no point in doing more pre-tests, but the minute you start having some issues with how the questionnaire is being answered or how the questionnaire is being interpreted, then any changes you make to it, you should really pre-test it again before you what's called go live or start using it for real. And some of those pre-tests can be as simple as asking friends and family. As long as they're going to honestly answer you, there's nothing wrong with doing some of those initial pre-tests. But once you start getting into the more serious, once you've got most of the little bugs worked out, then you should really be doing your pre-testing on a very small sample of who you're supposed to do your real survey on. Because those are the people that will show you, whether or not things are really going to work the way that you want them to. Timing-wise, just one of those reality things, logistics. Make sure you've allotted some time to make some changes in the process so that before you go live, you've made all the changes necessary. And, make sure that you get the respondents to give you as much information in this pre-testing so that you've got everything worked out before you go live. Final design and planning. Make those last edits, those last formatting, those last changes that you need to do. Good to do some coding at this point, and then you start into the actual data collection and analysis. When you're actually doing your data collection, make sure that you follow your methods and follow the plan as carefully as possible according to what you've already set out. There's no point trying to make any changes, and you should have had all those sort of changes worked out before getting to that stage, before going live. On that sort of, practical, logistical sort of thing, if you are going live in the field, if you're doing sort of personal interviews and things like that, or even sometimes this can be relevant for some online research, but it's more effective or more, I guess, relevant for in the field. When you're actually doing it, it's good to keep a diary of those sort of daily events which have occurred during that survey process. And, one reason I'll give you an example of this based on some personal experience. Doing some research in one of the national parks, and we were surveying people and usage of a trail. Now, I had the actual people doing the survey work for me keep a diary of what was going on, and I'm really glad several times, but in this one particular time, really glad that I did, because we noticed, a fairly steady flow of the types of users and the numbers of users on this one trail, but then we saw this huge spike. And luckily I had this diary to go back to, and I found out that on that day that there was a spike in usage, there was a charity walk that they had decided to use that trail for. So what it told me was that chances are the users on the trail on that particular day were probably not typical. So I should take a look at them separately to my everyday typical user of that trail. And if I hadn't done that, then that one group could have very seriously biased and changed some of the responses that I had for trail users. So again, good to keep that sort of daily diary of what's going on. And as I say on this slide here, actual analysis and writing of the report, we're going to talk about in a later week. One important aspect of conducting research is getting that sample and understanding how to get different types of sample and what effect those different samples can have on the information that you gather. Reality is most of the time you're going to have a sample of the population, and really that's all you need to do. So, and there's kind of two main ways or two main ideas behind sampling. One is what's called a probability sample, and the second is a non-probability sample. Difference being, probability samples, you're fairly certain right from the start the likelihood of what type of respondent you're going to get. Not how they're going to respond, but the type of respondent and how they fit in your population. A non-probability sample, you're really very uncertain and you're not sure what sort of respondent you're going to get from your population. And those two different types of sampling can potentially, not necessarily, but can potentially affect what sort of responses you get for your research. But not surprising, probability samples tend to be a lot more work and require a lot more prior understanding and knowledge of your population. So it's not always possible and not always necessary to have a probability sample. So, probability samples. A simple random sample and with a probability sample means that everybody in the population that you're investigating, that you're doing research on, has an equal chance of being chosen. Now, you can get random tables in the back of some statistics books and things like that, and there's different ways to get started and to use them, but essentially what it's saying is that you know how to get to every single person, and you're taking a simple random sample of that population. Systematic sampling, what you do instead of using these random numbers, what you're doing is you're starting with kind of a system or a way to get that person. You still know essentially how to get to every person in that population, but for example, you may choose, you start off with the seventh person on the list, and you choose every third person after that number 7, or vice versa. So you use your system of choosing every third person to decide who you're going to talk to. A kind of specialized sort of probability sample is something called a stratified random sample, where you've got certain groups within a population and you're trying to get a representative sample from each one of these groups. So for example, I show you the example there. You want to talk to visitors versus non-visitors to Canada in Mexico. So you've got this one population, essentially, or this one group called visitors, this other population of people called non-visitors, and you're going to sample each one of those groups in your total population of, in this case, Mexicans, and trying to understand the differences between those groups. Now, at times, what you may have to do is you may have to actually do what's called oversampling of a particular group, because you need a large enough sample to do analyses on, but that group is actually, if you were to go strictly based on proportion, strictly 5 to 1, there's 5 of these, there's one of these people in every 5 of the population. Well, you may have to talk to more than that in order to get enough people for your research. So suffice to say, stratified random samples are getting into the more complex way of getting a random sample or getting a group in your population. Cluster sampling is actually very different to that, in that with cluster sampling, instead, you're getting a group together, kind of generally based on geographic location, but not necessarily. And then you're sampling within that group, within that cluster. So for example, you're doing research on people in Vancouver. Well, then, rather than taking a random sample of all Vancouverites, what you may do is choose a few neighborhoods within Vancouver and then randomly sample from those neighborhoods. And as long as you've chosen your neighborhoods carefully and randomly sample within those neighborhoods carefully, then you can be fairly certain that that random sample of that cluster will suffice and will give you the accurate information for your research. Non-probability samples. Again, this is where you really have no prior understanding, no prior knowledge of how people are in your population, how big are the groups, things like that. Plus, you probably don't really have a good, accurate way of getting specific groups within that population. So you can't accurately target necessarily every third person in the population. And this can take a bit more careful planning right at the start, but it can give you essentially as good information when done properly. One aspect of non-probability sample to think about is what's called a quota sample, where you're trying to make sure you have enough people of a certain group to be able to talk to them or talk about them. Again, this is almost like that stratified sample, in that you're targeting, you've kind of separated off, or you want so many of each group. But again, because you don't know prior knowledge, you're just trying to get a certain number. For example, you may say that I want to speak to 50 men and 50 women. And you don't stop your research, you don't stop your surveying until you've got that 50 men and 50 women. So it may mean you get the 50 men fairly early, and you stop surveying men until you've got your 50 women, or vice versa. And all you're doing in that sort of situation is you're trying to make sure you get enough from each group, again, to be able to talk about each group confidently on their own. Dimensional sampling, that's when you're trying to get somewhat similar to a quota, but you're trying to get a certain characteristic or a certain dimension, and getting enough people from that certain group, that certain characteristic. So, you want to talk to 50 people in each of the groups that have watched between 0 and 2, and 2 and 4, and more than 4 hours of TV daily. So you make sure you've got 50 in each one of those groups in order to compare them and do your research on each one of those groups. A couple of other things. Convenience sample. That's where you choose what's convenient and what's possible, and kind of whoever, until you've got enough people for your research. Convenient sample, you have to be very, very careful, because it's very easy for it to not be representative unless it's done properly. For example, restaurant. Well, the serving staff may decide that, people that are nice, I'll give them a survey to fill out. Well, if they're only giving the survey out to people who are nice and who seem like they'll fill out the questionnaire, then it really doesn't become representative of all the types of people that may be visiting that restaurant. And you may come to conclusions that are completely incorrect if you're only surveying people who are nice and convenient and easy to give out this questionnaire. So, it's best generally to not go with what's called a convenience sample. Snowball sampling is sometimes used, especially when it's a very difficult group that you're trying to target. And so you use what's called a snowball sample in order to get at this very difficult to reach group. Example of this is you want to talk to a group of Mexicans who have been to Canada in the past 2 years. And it can be very difficult in the entire population of Mexico to choose and to find Mexicans who have been to Canada in the past 2 years. So the way the snowball sample works, you find a few people who are within your group, within that target group, and then after you have asked them the questions and they've completed the questionnaire, you get them to recommend some other people that they know also are part of that group. So, maybe you want to talk to Prius owners who also like staying at, people who are Prius owners who like going on eco tours. Well, you may have, find a few people that fall into that group and then get them to recommend other Prius owners who are also go on eco tours. Again, snowball sampling is a technique that isn't used all that often, but it can be very useful for getting a very hard to reach target market. And thank you very much, and that's it for this week. Okay? By the way, this image is one that I took a few years ago based in Riding Mountain National Park, looking out that town in the distance. It's a place called McCreary, Manitoba. Okay? Take it easy and have a good week.